This is why presidential debates are becoming unwatchable.
You want me to answer?
How much did you cut the bar?
You don't know what's happening. Gentlemen.
This is not a cage match.
The American Lyceum rebuilds the institution of debate as a cornerstone of our democracy. Once vital and informative, presidential debates have devolved into disrespectful, open mic,
Because you'd be in jail.
cage matches, abetted by cable media and partisan extremism.
The questions that have been asked so far in this debate illustrate why the American people don't trust the media.
When the only rules are ratings, politicians of all stripes aim to destroy instead of debate.
It reminds everybody of what they cannot stand about Washington.
That's an election. This is what we're here for. It's an election.
Setting a cultural tone that unleashes hostility on the streets. Mob violence by the left wing and the right wing are tolerated and normalized. Today, 30% of Democrats and 30% of Republicans believe political violence is justified. Tone at the top matters. For the Republic to survive, we the people must learn to talk to one another again.
That was a hot mess. It wasn't even a debate. The American people lost tonight.
The Lyceum format is focused on finding solutions, not a binary resolution. 3 participants have 3 minutes to propose 3 ideas aimed at one problem. The American Lyceum. Let us rebuild the foundation of civil society. Today's Lyceum debate answers the question, what reforms can protect U.S. democracy? The structure of the debate is each participant will have 3 minutes to present their 3 reform ideas, followed by questions in a 2-minute segment from the other participants. And then each participant will be given a 2-minute closing statement. The 3 participants today are myself and Bob Litan, co-founders here at the American Lyceum, and our guest, Shikha Dalmia, a visiting fellow at the Mercatus Center and a longtime writer for the New York Times, Bloomberg View, who has a regular column at The Week. Let's talk, listen, and learn together. It's probably no surprise as one of the co-founders of the Lyceum that I believe improving presidential primary debates is key to restoring our democracy, or really our resolution today is how to protect our democracy. We need to rebuild not just presidential debates, but primary debates. And that's the first idea I'm going to put forward. Later on in my remarks, I'll get to 2 other ideas. Number 2 being more federalism, and number 3 being let's reduce union power in the public sphere. But focusing on debates, I think it was 2008 that was the pivotal year. This is something that James Fallows wrote about in The Atlantic. He actually watched 47 debates, half on the Democratic side, half on the Republican side. And there was a real breakdown, not only in civility among the debaters, but just treating the whole thing a bit like a ratings circus for the networks, not really serving the public. You saw for the first time these big lineups of many, many candidates, a 1% threshold to get on the stage. And Fallows and also Jim Lehrer wrote a book about this. He's one of the more respected moderators. The candidates weren't really trying to win the presidency. They were trying to enhance their brand. You saw ridiculous lineups of lots of candidates ask questions, raise your hand if you believe or agree with this. And I believe it was an MSNBC in the very first debate that cycle that dispensed with opening statements. We need candidates who are willing to and able to talk for 3 minutes at a time without interruption. That's one of the ways we can protect our democracy. The second is a little bit more substantive in terms of policy, and it keys off of this most recent decision about abortion, where the Supreme Court didn't repeal abortion rights. They just said this isn't something that the federal government should have control over. It needs to be returned to the states and the people. I would argue that more federalism, meaning more local control, is a much healthier and stronger democracy. Some other examples are highway speed limits. We trust states to set their own. Minimum wages, states can set their own. Legalizing marijuana, for a long time that wasn't allowed. Now the states have seized back that power. I think these are good things. And I don't know what the right answers are on these policies. I don't think anybody does. We need the states to be laboratories for democracy. And I bring this up in particular because we often talk about weak links in the chain, or that we want to be unified, but we don't. We actually want a network of distributed risk taking. And I've sort of run out of time, but I'll quickly slam in here. Reducing public sector unions. Even FDR said the public sector shouldn't be unionized. We don't want police and firefighters and teachers to be unionized because, one, they're too expensive, and two, they're not serving the public's interest. And we see that most powerfully with teachers, and how teachers are at odds now with what's best for children in this recent COVID pandemic. And I'll get into that more later. But thanks for the opportunity to present those three ideas.
So, Tim, all of your ideas are interesting. I want to focus on your last one about public sector unions. You can obviously make good public policy arguments on both sides of unions, but why do you, or what is the connection you think between your proposal to, I assume, ban public sector unions and improving faith in democracy?
Well, I think the society, American society, worked fine. We're talking about the 1950s and 60s before public sector unions were legal and took hold. I believe it was John F. Kennedy who authorized them, because FDR had said before they weren't necessary, and it even was an outrageous idea. Over time, we've seen the wages for many public sector unions get incredibly bloated, and they're busting budgets, and it takes away services from other areas. And I think in particular, you end up getting really bad apples protected, bad teachers protected by union rules, and that hurts poor kids the most. So that's why it hurts our democracy and entrenches inequality.
Tim, that was very interesting. I have just one question for you. I'm all for federalism, but I am wondering, what limits do you envision to the federalism you are proposing? After all, free speech rights are not subject to state control, and neither are any of the other enumerated rights in the Constitution. So, what is the limit to your federalism?
So I would go back to a constitutional idea that lasted until 1925, which is where the federal government was extremely limited. And the 10th Amendment said if it wasn't specifically allowed to be given, this power reserved to the states. The limiting factors are two. One, every state is a republic. They're allowed to vote and control their laws. And two, the right of mobility. So you always have the right to leave a state if you think its rules are oppressive or don't work for you. Those are two limiting factors that are fundamental and guaranteed in the Constitution.
Thanks, Tim. In my view, the Republican Party needs to fix itself to improve our democracy. And here are the three things that I think need to be done. It needs to eschew populism, stop the big lie that the election was stolen, and then fix the electoral college to remove the red state advantage. So, number one, a populism. Conservatives need to push a popular, not a populist agenda. A populist agenda can be popular, but there is a difference. A popular agenda is one that is based on some conception of the common good. So it unites the country. A populist agenda, on the other hand, divides the country. It divides the country into good or real people and bad or unworthy people. And for the left, the bad and unworthy people are generally the exploitative rich. And for the MAGA right that we are witnessing right now, it is foreigners and liberals. This is tearing the country apart, and it's completely antithetical to everything that has actually made America great. The second thing that needs to happen is we need to end the big lie. The 2020 election was the most secure, accessible, and safe election ever held in this country. And that too at an enormously difficult time when there were protests and a pandemic. And yet it survived 60 plus court challenges alleging election fraud, and it didn't create any super spreading events. Yet President Trump has cried foul and has turned his base around it. Worse, as the January 6th House Select Committee hearings are showing, he tried to enlist the executive agencies such as the Department of Justice and Vice President Mike Pence to steal the election from Joe Biden and hand it to him. Now, one simple thing that Republicans can do to undercut Trump's big lie is to declare that the 2020 election was a national achievement and that questioning its results is un-American and it's anti-rational, and there is no room for it in their party. Now, the third thing they need to do is we need to balance the electoral college. One reason Republicans have become more extreme is that they can win president elections without getting the electoral college while losing the popular vote. There are more Democrats in safe red districts than Republicans in safe blue districts. So Republicans can win the electoral college with as little as 46 or 40%, 47% of the popular vote. This is causing Republicans to appeal to the base by fielding ever more extreme candidates. Eliminating the electoral college altogether and electing presidents with a straight popular vote is not desirable because that'll just give a systemic disadvantage to flyover rural Republicans, and we don't want that. But we should adjust the electoral formula to give populous urban states more representation in the electoral college compared to sort of the less populous rural states. And this might force Republicans to try and appeal to the broad electorate to win elections rather than just their base in rural red states.
So, Sheikha, I want to focus on your third suggestion about the Electoral College. As I understand it, it would take a constitutional amendment to change it, and that's a very high hurdle. There's clearly no incentive for Republicans to vote for such a thing. So, how would you ever get to implement the idea, however meritorious it would be? And by the way, I happen to believe it would be a good idea, but I don't see how you get from here to there.
Yeah, it's a good question, Bob, and I don't know if I have any easy fixes to it. I do think that we need to begin this conversation now, and I think a few brave Republicans need to put the interest of the country ahead of the party and try and deal with some of these structural, systemic incentives that are skewing the soul of their party. So yeah, you raise a good point, but I think we need to begin the conversation.
So Shika, I'm going to ask a couple questions. I guess one, I want to ask more, but you gave a good presentation. I guess I feel, and you know me, we see eye to eye on some really great issues on immigration, but I'm a Republican and I agree with a lot of the criticisms of any party, including my party. That'll make us stronger. But I always have this feeling like I want to say, but the other side's worse. And so, what do you say about populism among Democrats? And didn't they start all this, like the little lie, the violence in Wisconsin? What do you say about Democrats?
So I think Democrats have historically had a populist element in them, and I wouldn't deny that Bernie Sanders had a populist element, but I don't think what we are seeing with the MAGA right is, anything they have done is comparable to what we see with the MAGA right. I mean, in Trump, you got a man who did not countenance any limits to his executive power, was unwilling to live by any norms of good behavior or checks. And so they have, when Tim, you'll have a point when the Democrats appoint somebody like or vote somebody like President Trump. Till then, I think we have to just believe that the MAGA right is a bigger threat in terms of populism than the Democratic left.
So I'm glad to be here, but I'm worried about democracy for three reasons. One, I see a loss of civility, not just in politicians, but among ordinary people. And democracy doesn't work unless we have reasoned discourse. Second, there's been a loss of faith in our voting system, and voting is clearly essential, or the faith in voting is clearly essential to making democracy work. And third, there's been, I think, an erosion of confidence in the rule of law, and specifically in the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. That's been highlighted most recently by the very controversial abortion and gun rulings. So let me address three ideas to address each of these problems. One, on civility. I think at least we ought to start by having middle and high school students learn their subject matter through what I call debate-centered instruction. using the same kind of civil discourse that we're having here today, but using it to teach kids, actually teach themselves through debate. This has happened in Boston and Chicago for the last several years. I've written a book about this called Resolve, and it's a movement now that is beginning to take place in various parts of the country. It ought to be accelerated, and consistent with Tim's idea, it would be happening at the state level, because I do not envision a state mandate. Historically, education has been state-centered. The second idea on voting. This is primarily an issue that's been raised by the right, where they have questioned voting integrity. I do not believe there's any evidence to suggest that there's massive fraud, but nonetheless, we have a problem in democracy when 30 or 40% of the people don't really have confidence in the voting system. And therefore, I am supportive of having voter ID laws that are suitable to protect the rights of all people. In other words, not just driver's licenses, but use the idea that's been floated by Senator Manchin to use alternative means if you don't have a driver's license to secure identification. It can be utility bills, it can be Medicare numbers. I live in Kansas, and when I apply for voting, they ask me my Medicare number for proof. When I ask for a driver's license, so I don't see why we can't do that for voting as well. And finally, on rule of law, this is a conditional proposal, so I'm not 100% confident in it, but I'm intrigued by it. And this is primarily the loss of confidence in the Supreme Court is coming from the left, or maybe I would argue from a large portion of the center of the country. I'm intrigued with the idea of requiring that the Supreme Court be evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. Either 8 people, and you don't have to have an odd number. When the country was founded, the Supreme Court only had 6 people, and I would be willing to sacrifice the 9 to go to 8 and have it evenly divided, because that would promote incentives for at least compromise on key issues and secure a lot more faith in decisions that come down from the Supreme Court than we have now. I know there are a lot of technicalities to be ironed out, but I'm very intrigued with that idea. After all, we have representation of both Democrats and Republicans on various agency commissions. Why not have it in the Supreme Court?
All right, Bob, I'm going to be a little more partisan than I had hoped, but I still remember the 2000 election with Al Gore complaining that it wasn't fair. Hillary Clinton never really admitted the legitimacy of President Trump. And Stacey Abrams was alleging, fraud or abuse or something, and never, cast doubt on the legitimacy. So don't Democrats deserve a lot of the blame here?
Well, the Al Gore example is a poor one because he actually conceded very graciously, in contrast to the way President Trump did, which was basically an insurrection, the only kind of thing like that in American history. What I'm trying to address specifically is what you see in public opinion polls, that a lot of voters believe wrongly that there's a lot of fraud. And I think you can reduce that belief if we have tighter voter ID laws, but make allowances, as I said, for alternative forms of identification. And I think that would increase confidence in elections.
So I actually agree with you that I don't think there is any comparison between Trump and Al Gore or Hillary or Stacey Abrams. But my question actually is the converse of Tim's, which is that President Trump's own election fraud commission found no evidence of fraud and had to disband. So while voter ID laws are not the worst laws that one can think of, do you think they'll really accomplish anything given the bad faith in the Republican Party in questioning elections right now?
Yes, I do. I want to address a very legitimate concern. Not that the concern is legitimate, because I think that there's, as you said, no evidence of massive voter fraud. But when you have 30 to 40% of the country believing that there's fraud, you have to do something to address that concern, because we can't go on in a country where basically people do not accept the legitimacy of presidents who are elected. And I think it would be a major step, at least, to address this concern, however ill-founded it might be, to at least tell people that there's going to be some form of voter ID.
We often make the mistake that we think our democracy is permanent, meaning it was the same for our parents and grandparents as it is for us. In fact, the democracy is constantly evolving, sometimes for the better, but sometimes for the worse. And I think what we're focused on today is those worsening evolutionary steps are actually putting the whole project at risk. Now, I'd point to, in reverse order, the year 2009. My third point: public sector unions had membership had always been smaller than private sector. You know, folks like coal miners, which is why union power was recognized by the government. But against FDR's wishes, 2009 was that turning point where we saw people working for the government now have safer jobs, higher paying jobs, longer lasting jobs, and we see a lot less innovation in government and a ton of bloat, so that we're crowding out money that should be spent on things like roads and frankly, schools. We see more bureaucrats working in our schools instead of teachers in the classroom. So we've got to cut down the power of public sector unions. I don't think that got enough attention in this debate. Number two for me, an institutional devolution, is our constant loss of federalism. We need to return that power to the states. And then the one that I started out with was presidential debates. That was an institution not enshrined in the Constitution, but an institution nonetheless that was how we organized ourselves as a society. And that has dissolved now to the point where it's an embarrassment. And it used to be profoundly educational, something the whole world would tune into. And we need to really get back to setting up some baseline so that when leaders are selected for each of the parties, before they become presidential candidates, that we have a process that everyone can be proud of and respect. So let's fix these. Public sector unions, fix the debates, and get some more federalism. We'll be a better democracy.
I agree that our democracy is in trouble, more trouble than I think it has ever been, with the exception of the Civil War. And I think the main problem is the growing polarization and extremism in this country. And extremism, I'm afraid, particularly of the right in this country. And I'm not being partisan over here. I'm a libertarian, have never had carried any water for the Democratic Party. But I think the Republican Party is sort of off the charts right now, post-Trump. And although there are many good suggestions that have been made here today, Tim, no disagreement about reforming public sector unions or eliminating them. The Republicans had been doing that with right to work laws. My fear right now is that the Republican Party is going to reinvent itself as the workers' party to appeal to its populist base. And I think, therefore, attacking this populism within the Republican Party is really the number one political project. That means doing whatever we can to push back against the big lie that the election was stolen, holding Republicans accountable when they don't stand up for the integrity of the last election. And I think the long-term fix, although it is a little unrealistic, but less unrealistic perhaps than Bob's split court, is fixing the Electoral College to give more weight to some of the coastal regions, so that the Republicans are not constantly tempted to win by just the popular vote instead of also the electoral vote and appealing to the whole gamut of voters, not just their base. I think all those three are extremely important fixes.
What's kind of surprising to me is how much agreement there is, I think, among us at least, on some of these ideas that are relatively non-controversial. I mean, who could object to Tim's idea of making sense out of the debate structure for president? I'm not sure how much difference it will make for democracy, but it will certainly help. I think on federalism, by default, that's where we're going. Because of the dysfunction in Washington, the only thing you can get done anywhere is through the states and have experimentation. My idea of having debate-centered instruction in middle school and high school, it's starting to happen. I'm working in my spare time to help make it happen. And I think over time, more and more people will embrace it. So it's a relatively easy thing. I actually think tougher voter ID laws that will instill more confidence are also possible, because I think there's room for compromise, as Senator Manchin's proposed. Now, I think we get into more areas of controversy on public sector unions. I can see arguments on both sides. I think there's been an unfortunate demonizing of a lot of government workers, but I do understand Tim's point that I think there is a feeling among a lot of people who don't have safe, secure jobs, and they're in an age of anxiety. I can see why they don't have a lot of respect for government workers, and unions, or the ability to strike, is something that can cause a lot of resentment. But I think in order to address demonization, if we're ever going to have that trade-off to have less unionization, I do think there are some government workers who are actually underpaid. I think in general, teachers are underpaid. I'm not necessarily saying I'm for unions, but I think that for what they do, they are underpaid. And finally, we didn't spend a lot of time on my most controversial idea about having an evenly split Supreme Court, Democrats or Republicans. I think there are a lot of technical details how to get there, but I really truly believe that if it was evenly split, we'd have a lot more confidence in both sides and incentives for compromise that would help heal our very troubled country.
Thanks for watching. There are 3 ways you can help us strengthen civil society. 1, like this video. 2, share the link. And 3, subscribe to the Lyceum Debates YouTube channel. Now that you've heard the debate, it's time to cast your vote for what you think were the best ideas. Here's how it works. Go to the AmericanLyceum.org debates page to cast your vote. Or you can go directly to the voting page by clicking the link in the description below. This debate was made possible thanks to the J.P. Conte Family Foundation. If you support our effort to rebuild American civil society, please make a donation to the Lyceum right now. Your donation will be tax deductible and is deeply needed. Go to theamericanlyceum.org. Thanks again to all the Lyceum donors who are rebuilding American civil society.